He expected a plain bride, but her beauty made the cowboy's heart tremble. The whistle of the train echoed, tearing through the late afternoon air at Willow Creek station, rolling across the dusty red hills. Townsfolk gathered on the wooden platform, boots scraping against the planks with a creak, their hushed whispers drifting like wind through leaves. Everyone expected an ordinary bride, humble, modest, perhaps easy to lose in a crowd. But when Emma stepped down from the train car, her figure emerging through the swirl of white steam, the platform fell into silence. The last rays of the day broke open across her hair, and her radiant beauty struck like a spark on dry prairie grass, dangerous yet impossible to look away from. Jacob Thornton, the cowboy, waiting with a heart long locked in solitude, stood frozen. He thought he was prepared for duty, yet destiny had sent him a challenge far greater a beauty, with the power either to bring him to his knees or to save his life. Before we begin, take a moment to comment the name of your city wherever you're listening from tonight, and when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now, find yourself a quiet corner, take a deep breath, and let the whispers of the Wild West carry you into tonight's tale. Night fell slowly over Jacob Thornton's barren ranch. Above him the stars hung faint and scattered, as fragile as the last embers still glowing in the cowboy's weary heart. Out beyond the fence line, the wind whistled through the rotting posts, carrying with it the scent of cracked earth and fading pine smoke from a fire long gone cold. Inside the silent wooden cabin, Jacob sat before an old table. The oil lamp cast a warm golden light, stretching his shadow across the worn floorboards. Calloused fingers, more accustomed to reins and a gun, now fumbled awkwardly over a blank sheet of paper. He began to write. The words came clumsy, plain, without flourishes. They were simply the voice of a man who had lived too long in solitude. My name is Jacob Thornton. I own a small ranch with little wealth, just a few head of cattle and a stretch of dry land. I cannot promise riches, only this wooden home and a heart that longs for a hand to walk beside it. If someone is willing, I will spend my life protecting and loving her. His hand stilled the pen, trembling. For a moment, even the wind outside seemed to quiet. Jacob lifted his tired eyes to the wavering lamp flame, as though asking himself if anyone would ever truly answer. He folded the letter and blew out the light. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the heavy thud of his heartbeat and the fragile shape of a dream he barely dared believe in. That night, across the vast West, a lonely cowboy sent out the smallest call of his life, just a flicker of hope waiting for someone to see it and come near. Part 1. The Shock at the Station. Noon sunlight poured down on Willow Creek station, fierce and blinding. Heat rose from the faded wooden planks, making the air ripple like smoke. Townsfolk crowded onto the platform, boots, thudding voices buzzing in a restless hum. Some came to gossip, others out of plain curiosity. Everyone wanted to witness a rare sight, a bride ordered from afar stepping onto this barren land for the first time. They imagined a shy country girl, eyes full of worry, a small figure in need of protection. Shakes of the head, half-hidden smirks, they were already prepared to mock her. The train whistle shrieked long and deep, followed by a rush of hot steam. Slowly the carriage door opened. Through the white haze, a figure stepped down. Emma. She was nothing like they had pictured. A pale silk dress traced the lines of her body. Soft brown hair fell like a river over her shoulders. Her deep blue eyes glimmered in the sunlight. Every step of her shoes against the boards sounded like a drumbeat, striking the stunned silence. The platform froze. A woman dropped her handbag. A child clung to his mother's hand. Smiles meant for ridicule vanished, replaced by wide-eyed stares of disbelief. Jacob Thornton stood among them, still as stone. His cowboy hat shadowed half his face, but it could not hide the shock in his eyes. He had prepared himself for an ordinary woman, a simple answer to his solitude. But standing before him was no ordinary bride. Hers was a beauty that could halt a town's breath and throw his heart off its steady rhythm. Emma's gaze swept the crowd. For a fleeting second, her eyes met Jacob's, somber, steady, yet betraying a quiet turmoil he could not conceal. A sudden gust of wind swept through, lifting the red dust across the platform. In that instant, everyone knew something unusual had arrived in Willow Creek. and no one could guess how this moment would change two destinies. The whispers returned, but no longer the snickers prepared in advance. They carried surprise, unease. She doesn't look like the other mail-order brides. Too beautiful. What could she be hiding? Jacob Thornton has no idea what he's gotten himself into. Eyes followed Emma like flames racing through dry grass. Jacob remained still. Inside, his heartbeat pounded like hooves across the prairie. His throat tightened. He had never imagined the woman stepping off that train would carry a beauty that silenced an entire station. All he had wanted was companionship, a warm presence by the lonely wooden table in his cabin. But fate had sent him something he was not sure he could face. Emma stood tall, gloves clenched tight, though her heart spun with doubt. From the letters she'd received, she had pictured a rugged man in a harsh, forgotten land. She had braced herself for pity, even scorn. Yet the stunned silence unsettled her. They were not mocking, not yet. They were only staring as if she were something far too different. Sunlight poured over her face, catching the fragile pride in her expression. A bead of sweat traced her temple, shining like a pearl. Amid the echo of iron wheels and wind, Jacob forced himself forward. He lifted his hat, stepping closer, each movement heavy, but sure. His deep eyes searched hers as if to find something true beneath her dazzling appearance, a soul that knew fear, that longed for a home. Miss Emma. His voice was low, rough, each word dropping like a stone into a deep well. Emma gave the slightest nod. Her lips pressed tight to hide a tremor. She said nothing, only met the cowboy's solemn gaze. For a heartbeat in the midst of a watching town, there seemed to be no one else alive. Jacob extended his hand, not too fast, not too close, an invitation into the world he had built from hardship and solitude. Emma hesitated, then placed her small hand in his calloused palm. A brief touch, but enough to make the crowd hold its breath. The bell clanged as the train pulled away, carrying Emma's past into the distance. She drew a deep breath, tasting the red prairie dust in her lungs. In that moment, she knew she had stepped into a life entirely new, one where every eye in town would follow her every move. Jacob said nothing, only tightened his grip, a quiet promise without words. He didn't know what lay ahead, but deep down he understood this was the beginning of a journey with no turning back. As Jacob led Emma away from the crowd, whispers broke free. Beauty like that can only mean trouble. She'll never last a winter out here. What's Jacob thinking, bringing her to that barren ranch of his? Laughter coughs and probing stares pressed against her back like needles. Emma heard it all, each word like a blade across her skin. She kept her spine straight, her steps steady, though her heart raced. Since leaving home, she had known this road would not be easy. Still, she had not expected judgment to strike so quickly, so sharp. Jacob gave no answer to any voice around them. He lowered his head, walking firm, guiding Emma toward the waiting wagon. The sun beat down, wind whipping red dust into the air. Silently, he helped her aboard, his rough hands steady, careful. The horse snorted softly, then pulled them away from the station. Wheels crunched over dry earth. The crowd dwindled to small shadows in Emma's eyes. She sat upright, hands clenched in her lap to hide the trembling. Inside the wooden wagon, the smell of old leather and dried hay mixed with the sting of dust. Hooves struck a steady rhythm. The reins creaked in Jacob's grip. The silence between them grew heavy, almost solid. Jacob stared ahead at the endless road toward his ranch. No words came. Inside him churned surprise, confusion, even fear at the force of what he felt. All he had wanted was someone ordinary, a presence by the fire. Now beside him sat a woman whose beauty had stopped a town, and he wondered if he could protect her from the weight of so many stares, so many judgments. Emma turned slightly, looking out the window. The prairie stretched endless under the burning sun, the ground cracked and dry. Mountains rose gray and silent on the horizon, ancient witnesses to countless fates. Wind swept across the land, carrying sand that blurred the view. She could feel it in her bones. This was not a gentle land. It was a place where only the strong, the steadfast survived. Her gaze flickered back to Jacob. He sat upright, broad shoulders, one hand firm on the reins, silent as stone. And in that silence, Emma sensed something steady and unspoken strength, a presence she might hold on to in the storm to come. The wagon rolled on across the dusty road, leaving behind Willow Creek Station and its whispers. A strange beginning had been planted, woven of curiosity, doubt, and a fragile bond between two souls who had only just met. Part 2. The Empty House. The wagon rolled away from Willow Creek Station, leaving behind the weight of staring eyes and whispers that still seemed to linger in the wind. Ahead, the road shimmered with the glow of afternoon, while red dust billowed beneath the wheels, swirling upward with every steady strike of the horse's hooves. Emma sat upright, her back perfectly straight, her gloved hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the window, where endless prairie grass stretched out in brittle gold beneath the harsh western sun. The wind pressed against the wagon with a furnace heat, carrying the sharp taste of cracked earth, mingling with the smells of old leather and weathered wood inside the small cabin. Each sound, the creak of the wheels, the rhythmic clop of hooves, the whistle of dry wind, was a reminder this was not the gentle countryside of her childhood with wildflowers and clear rivers. This was a land stripped bare by sun and storm, a land where only the strong endured. Beside her, Jacob Thornton sat silent. His broad shoulders cast long shadows across the seat. One hand gripped the reins, steady, unyielding, while his face remained hidden beneath the brim of his hat. His eyes never left the road ahead. From time to time, a gust of wind would loosen a strand of Emma's soft brown hair, brushing it against the rough fabric of his coat. Yet, neither spoke. Strangers bound together, still searching for words that would bridge the distance between them. Inside Jacob's chest, his heart beat with a restless strength. He had told himself he wanted only companionship, a quiet presence to ease the silence of his cabin. Yet seated beside him now was a woman whose beauty had stunned an entire town. Beauty like that, he thought, could be dangerous, and he knew it would bring trouble for her and trouble for him. The sun sank lower, spilling red light across the horizon. Shadows lengthened on the prairie until the land itself seemed to exhale into dusk. At last, the wagon slowed before a small, weathered cabin standing solitary in a wide stretch of barren earth. Emma lifted her eyes and felt her heart sink. The house stood, faded, its boards gray from years of wind and sand. The porch roof leaned precariously, its beams sagging under time. Gaps split the walls where the desert air had pried its way in. No garden grew here. No fence stood guard. No trees offered shade. Only the ceaseless wind, the groan of a door on tired hinges, and the chill of emptiness wrapped around the place. Jacob climbed down first, securing the horse to a post. Then in silence, he circled around to open the wagon door. He extended a calloused hand, steady but careful, as though afraid she might break beneath his touch. Emma placed her cool hand in his, and for a fleeting second, their palms met, roughness and softness colliding. But almost immediately, Jacob pulled away, withdrawing into the safety of distance. "This is my home," he said, his voice low and husky like wind through cracks in old wood. Emma stepped down, her small boots crunching over the dry earth. She followed him toward the door, her eyes scanning every detail, the porch planks warped with time, the shutters hanging loose, the way the prairie wind seemed to own the place more than any man. The door opened with a weary creak, releasing a rush of stale air laced with smoke long faded from pine logs burned in winters past. Inside, the cabin revealed itself in muted tones. A single room stretched wide, dim light filtering in through a window smudged with dust. At the center stood a rough wooden table scarred by knives and years of solitude, with a few crooked chairs scattered around it. A pair of worn boots lay abandoned beneath the table. A row of jackets, stiff with dust, hung limply from nails in the wall. There were no curtains, no flowers, no soft touches of another hand. The air itself seemed empty, hollow, with the silence of a man who had lived too long alone. Emma stood still, her eyes drifting slowly across the room. She smelled old wood, faint smoke, and the sharp scent of wild wind sneaking through cracks in the boards. Every detail told her the same truth: no woman had ever lived here. Jacob moved ahead, striking a match and lighting an oil lamp on the table. A soft, golden glow flickered across his face, casting his features in weary relief. The lines around his eyes deepened, carved by sun and solitude. This way, he murmured, gesturing toward the narrow staircase. The steps groaned beneath their weight as they climbed. Dust stirred in the glow of the lamp, curling upward like ghosts of time. At the top, Jacob stopped before a small door and pushed it open. The room inside was bare, almost stark. A wooden bed frame stood against one wall, its quilt worn thin by years. A small chest of drawers leaned slightly, its handle loose. A single window looked out upon the endless prairie, where the last light of sunset bled pale gold into the horizon. "Your room," Jacob said softly, almost hesitant. After a pause, he added, "Not much, but quiet." Emma set her small valise down by the bed. She ran her finger lightly across the surface of the chest. Dust clung to her glove, leaving a faint trail behind. Her heart beat quick, heavy with disappointment, with loneliness that crept in despite her best efforts to stand tall. Was this to be her new home? A place stripped bare, colder than the emptiness she had carried inside herself all these past months. Turning, she found Jacob watching her. He stood in the doorway. His tall frame shadowed his eyes, uncertain, caught between distance and a strange, awkward tenderness. Something in his silence made her unsure. Was it a silence to fear, or a silence she might one day trust? "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely more than breath. Jacob gave a brief nod. Without another word, he stepped back, leaving her alone. The door closed with a soft thud, sealing the room in quiet. Emma sank onto the edge of the bed. The quilt felt coarse beneath her hand. Through the window, the prairie stretched into twilight, the grass whispering beneath the sweep of the wind. The sound rose and fell like a long, mournful song echoing her own heart. She understood then it was not only the house that was empty. The man who lived here too carried a hollow space inside him, and now she carried her own emptiness into the same walls. But as she lifted her eyes once more, she caught the faintest glimmer of sunlight, the last trace of day spilling gold across the window pane. Fragile though it was, the light lingered, and in that fragile light, Emma felt the smallest stirring of something beyond emptiness. Hope. Part 3. The first meal night fell quickly across the barren land. The sky darkened into a deep velvet blue scattered with distant stars, silent pale sparks too faint to chase away the chill that seeped into the very boards of the wooden cabin. Inside the small dining room, an oil lamp flickered weakly. Its flame leaned and swayed with every breath of wind that slipped through the cracks in the door. The golden light spilled across the rough-hewn table, stretching shadows long and thin across the floor. That table had stood witness to years of silence, years in which Jacob Thornton had eaten alone. Tonight, however, two shadows fell upon its surface. The first meal they shared was humble to the point of sorrow, a loaf of hard bread, a portion of salted meat, and a pot of beans still warm from the stove. The food gave off a faint, comforting smell, though it carried no fragrance of herbs, no richness that spoke of home. It was survival food, nothing more. Emma sat quietly, her gloved hand resting on the spoon before her. She had not yet lifted it to her lips. Instead, her eyes wandered across the room. The walls, built from rough planks of pine, held no pictures. The shelves stood nearly bare save for a jar of salt, a jar of pepper, and little else. The chairs around the table leaned with age, their joints loose, their backs worn smooth by years of solitary use. There was nothing soft, nothing graceful, no sign that a woman's hand had ever softened this place. Across from her, Jacob ate slowly, his head bent, his motions steady and deliberate. He ate not with enjoyment, but with habit, as though food was only fuel for the work that awaited tomorrow. Yet tonight, things were different. Tonight, a woman sat across from him, a woman whose quiet gaze unsettled him, whose presence filled the air with a fragile weight he could not ignore. Her beauty was undeniable. But what troubled Jacob more was the way her eyes held both wonder and uncertainty, as if she were bracing herself against the rawness of this land. He cleared his throat. The sound was rough, breaking through the silence. "The meals here." His voice came low and gravelly, each word shaped with effort. "They aren't much. I've lived alone for a long time, so everything is simple." Emma lowered her eyes, brushing the edge of the spoon with her fingertip. "I do not expect much," she replied softly. Her voice was no more than a whisper, like a thread of air that drifted across the table. She thought of saying more, that from the moment she stepped off the train she had known this road would be hard, that she had steeled herself for it. But the words caught in her throat, and silence seemed truer. The wind howled faintly outside, pressing against the door. The lamp flame quivered, casting golden patterns that danced across Jacob's face and Emma's bowed head. Jacob lifted his eyes, studying her. She sat straight-backed, composed, her long lashes veiling her deep blue eyes. There was a weariness about her, yes, but also a dignity, as though she wished to prove she was stronger than she felt, that she would not break beneath this land's unforgiving weight. Jacob set his spoon down. For a long moment he said nothing, then raised his gaze to meet hers directly. His eyes were steady, yet uncertain, his voice slow, each word chosen carefully. "I'm not a man of many words," he admitted. "Writing that letter, it wasn't easy. I wrote it because I could not go on living in silence. I needed someone beside me. Not a servant, not something to decorate the house, just someone to share the air inside these walls." Emma's breath caught. She looked up, startled by the plainness of his honesty. She had not expected such words from a man so quiet, so guarded. Yet the simplicity of his confession struck deeper than any polished speech could. Her lips trembled, then curved into the faintest smile as she whispered, "I bring no riches, nothing more than 2 hands and what strength I still have left. But if what you want is someone to share the burden with, then I can try." For a moment the house seemed to still. Even the restless wind outside grew faint, as though listening. Jacob did not answer at once, but his dark eyes softened. He gave a slow nod, heavy with meaning. "Then we'll live as partners," he said. "I'll see to the fields. You tend to the house. If something doesn't sit right, we speak of it plain. I can't promise ease, but I promise this: I'll respect you." Emma felt the words settle over her like a blanket, lifting a weight she had not realized she carried. Respect. It was not sweet promise nor vow of eternity. But in this strange house, on her first night, far from all she had known, it was enough. Enough to kindle the smallest flame inside her chest. She smiled, small, tentative, like the last glow of sunset lingering on the horizon. "Agreed," she said. Her voice wavered, yet it held a quiet strength. They resumed their meal. The silence between them had shifted. It no longer pressed heavy, threatening to swallow every heartbeat. Instead, it was gentler, as if 2 souls strangers until this day had placed the first stones of a bridge that might one day span the emptiness between them. When the plates were empty, Jacob rose. His chair scraped against the wood. He gathered the dishes with slow, methodical movements. Emma stood too, reaching for the bowls. But Jacob shook his head. Next time, he said simply. The words were plain, yet within them lay a surprising tenderness. As though he was telling her, "You've taken your first step into my life. There will be time for more." Later, Emma lay on the bed upstairs. The quilt scratched against her palms. The boards of the house creaked in the wind. Outside, the prairie moaned with a long, hollow cry, the sound of loneliness stretching across miles of grass. Yet in her mind, one phrase repeated itself again and again until sleep began to pull her down. "I'll respect you." In the cold of that first night, those 3 words glowed like an ember, and somewhere deep inside her hope took root, small, uncertain, yet alive. Part 4. The Night of the Wolves. Night descended over the ranch with a weight that pressed against every wall and fence post. A thin crescent moon hung above, pale and distant, spilling silver light across the cracked, thirsty earth. The wind slid through the gaps in the wooden boards, sighing like the restless breath of a wandering soul. Inside the small cabin, the oil lamp sputtered and swayed. Its golden flame sent Emma's shadow stretching across the wall, slender, fragile, yet marked with a stillness that suggested quiet strength. Jacob sat by the window, his eyes fixed on the darkness outside. His ears knew the language of the plains at night, the whistle of the wind, the high-pitched hum of crickets, the groan of old timber tightening in the cold. But tonight carried something different, something sharp, unnerving. It came drifting across the prairie low and drawn out a sound that sliced through the silence. A howl, then another. The wolves were near. Emma flinched her fingers, clutching the edge of the table. Her eyes searched the black horizon beyond the glass. "They're close, aren't they?" she whispered, her voice carrying both fear and the need to be sure. Jacob nodded, the brim of his hat dipping into the lamplight. His broad shoulders seemed larger in the glow. "They're hungry," he said, his voice deep and steady. "They'll head for the cattle pens." He rose, his boots thudding softly against the floor, and reached for the rifle hanging on the wall. For a moment he turned toward her. He had meant to tell her to stay inside, but something in her eyes stopped him. Blue eyes shining not only with fear, but with a strange light, a spark of resolve. "Give me another one," she said. Jacob's brows drew together. "You've handled a gun before," Emma lifted her chin, nodding once. "My father taught me when I was 12. He said a frontier girl must learn to defend herself." For a heartbeat, Jacob studied her, testing her words in silence. Then he reached for another rifle, a Winchester with a worn wooden stock, and placed it carefully in her hands. She wrapped her fingers around it with a surety that startled him. Not hesitant, not fumbling, confident. Together they stepped out onto the porch. The prairie lay wide and silver under the moon. Wind swept cold across the fields, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and the faint tang of danger. Another howl rose from the darkness, this time closer, joined by others, a chorus of throats fierce and wild, trembling the night air. Jacob lifted his rifle, narrowing his eyes toward the pens. Beside him, Emma did not shrink back. She stood straight, her gaze sharp, her breath even. She did not hide behind him. She stood with him. Then it came a blur of gray fur bursting from the tall grass. The wolf's eyes glowed, catching the moonlight. Jacob's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle thundered. Flames spat from the barrel. The night cracked with the sound. The wolf tumbled, hitting the earth hard. But even before the echo faded, two more shapes lunged from the shadows, fast, snarling, relentless. Jacob swung his rifle upward. Another shot rang out, though not from him, from her. Emma's Winchester spoke sharp and clean. The bullet found its mark. The second wolf fell. Its cry split the air, then went still. Jacob turned his head, stunned. The woman at his side still held the rifle steady. Her hair whipped in the wind, her eyes glimmered like steel beneath the moon. Her hand did not tremble. "There's one more," she said, her voice calm, unbroken. And there it was, another set of eyes flashing in the dark, circling, gauging. The third wolf growled, but after the two gunshots it hesitated. The beast lowered itself, ears twitching, then spun and melted back into the night. Silence returned. Only the pounding of hearts remained and the bitter tang of gun smoke drifting across the porch. Jacob lowered his rifle, his gaze locked on her. For a moment, he no longer saw the stranger he had met at the station, the beautiful bride ordered from miles away. He saw someone else, someone who could stand beside him shoulder to shoulder, not only in the quiet of the house, but in the teeth of danger. Emma exhaled, setting the rifle down gently. Her chest rose and fell with the release of tension. She turned and found Jacob watching her, his dark eyes softened, lit with something like awe. No words passed between them, but the air itself seemed to carry an understanding. A bridge had formed, unseen, yet undeniable. At last, Jacob broke the silence. His voice was rough-edged with wonder. "You shoot true." Emma smiled, then a small curve of lips lit faintly by the moon. "I told you, I can take care of myself." Her smile was not boastful, not proud, just steady, a quiet affirmation of who she was. And under the sweep of the wind, beneath the haunting cries of the prairie, Jacob found himself believing her. They gathered the rifles and stepped back into the cabin. The lamplight flickered golden against the cool silver of the moon. Emma hung the rifle carefully on its hook, her movements unhurried, graceful even in exhaustion. For Jacob, the house felt different now. Less hollow, less silent. Something had shifted, not in the walls, but in the space between them. Later, when Emma lay awake in her room, the cries of wolves no longer echoed outside. Only the wind sang, brushing against the window. steady as a lullaby. She closed her eyes, recalling the sound of Jacob's voice, low and sincere. "You shoot true." It was not a compliment meant to charm. It was respect. And in that respect, something stirred fragile like a seed pressed into the hard earth of a dry plain. A seed that might one day take root. In the emptiness of the cabin and the vast loneliness of the prairie, two strangers had shared more than a meal, more than words. They had shared a night of danger, a moment of trust, and that moment was enough to light a small fire in the darkness, just enough to warm the cold silence of the house. Part 5. Digging for water. The sun hung mercilessly above the ranch, a white fire burning in the endless western sky. Its heat poured down like molten glass, searing every blade of grass still clinging to life. The earth lay split and broken, its surface marked with jagged cracks that spidered across the land. Red dust swirled upward in the hot wind, coating skin, clothing, even breath itself. The ranch stood silent, caught in the grip of thirst. At the dry trough, cattle shuffled slowly, their ribs showing, their tongues rasping across the wood as they licked the last traces of water. When nothing remained, their dark eyes turned to Jacob Thornton, pleading without words. Jacob leaned against the fence, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt, his face darkened by both sun and worry. His eyes roamed the brittle pasture stretching before him. He knew the truth with painful clarity. Without water, nothing would last. Not the herd, not the land, and not the fragile hope he had tried to keep alive. Behind him, Emma stepped onto the porch, a folded cloth in her hand, the last damp piece of fabric she had managed to keep cool inside the house. She paused, watching him stand heavy under the sun, his shoulders carrying the weight of more than land. She spoke softly, her voice weaving into the hot wind. "Is there no other way?" Jacob turned his head. In the blaze of sunlight, his eyes flickered with something fierce, a glint of resolve. "There's only one way left," he answered. "We dig a well." And so they began. Jacob drove the shovel hard into the ground. The metal struck with a dull clang, fighting against the baked soil. Each thrust shattered only a little at a time, sending clods of dust flying into the air. Sweat rolled down his temples, streaking through the grime, dripping onto the earth that swallowed it whole. Emma did not remain in the shade. She stepped forward, seized another shovel, and wrapped her slender hands firmly around its worn handle. At first her swings were clumsy, the blade catching dirt scattering wide, but she gritted her teeth, matching her rhythm to his. Soon the awkward strokes grew steadier, firmer. Each breath came quicker, her cheeks flushed with heat, but her eyes stayed clear, determined. Jacob stole a glance at her. For a moment, surprise flickered through him. He had not expected her to take up the labor, not with such will. He said nothing, but in the quiet of his gaze lay a spark of respect. The sun climbed higher, burning its path overhead. The air shimmered as though the whole world was melting. Still they worked. The pit deepened slowly, each strike echoing like a drumbeat against stone. The sound of shovels biting earth, of ragged breaths of pounding hearts together. It became a rough, stubborn music of the frontier. Emma wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. Her skin glowed with the heat, and blisters swelled along her palms. But her spirit did not waver. Her voice rasped, hoarse but steady. "Do you think we'll find it?" Jacob paused, standing in the pit, his chest rising and falling. He peered down into the dark soil beneath him, then exhaled. "We must," he said. His tone carried no choice, only certainty. "There is no other way." Hours stretched long. The sun dipped past its peak and the light softened, but their bodies grew heavier with every stroke. The hole deepened until Jacob stood below ground, his head nearly level with the earth. Above, Emma knelt at the rim, hauling buckets of dirt, her hands blackened, her hair clinging to her damp face. Yet despite exhaustion, she smiled, faint but real, each time she lifted another load away. It was not just soil they moved. It was the weight of despair, lifted shovel by shovel, replaced with fragile faith. Then at last, something changed. Jacob's shovel struck with a duller sound, softer than before. He froze, then bent down, scraping at the soil with his bare hand. A coolness met his skin. The earth crumbled damp against his palm, and slowly, blessedly, moisture seeped between his fingers. His breath caught. His eyes lit with something that had been absent for too long. Water. He whispered, almost afraid the word itself might vanish if spoken too loud. Emma leaned forward, her heart racing. She scrambled down a little, her eyes shining in the glow of the lowering sun. Truly, Jacob nodded, unable to stop the rare smile that spread across his face. He dug faster, scooping aside clumps of damp earth. The soil darkened, and then faint, but real, a thin trickle began to emerge. Droplets gathered, sliding into a rivulet and then into a small pool. The sound was faint, but to their ears it rang like music, the quiet, miraculous murmur of water. The prairie wind still blew hot and dry, but its cry was no longer the only sound. Now beneath it there was the gentle whisper of life returning. Emma crouched low, pressing her dirty hand into the damp earth. Cool water seeped between her fingers, glistening as she lifted her palm into the air. A single droplet caught the light of sunset, glowing like a jewel. She turned to him, her voice trembling with both relief and triumph. "Not you alone," she said softly. "We found it together." Jacob let out a rough laugh, low and short, the kind of laugh that seemed foreign on his lips, but utterly true. His chest loosened for the first time in many weary days. Together, he echoed. The pool widened as the ground released more of its hidden treasure. It was not much yet, but it was water. It was enough. As the sun sank behind the hills, painting the sky in strokes of amber and violet, they sat side by the rim of the new well. Their clothes clung to their skins, stained with dirt and sweat. Their hands were raw, their bodies aching. And yet in their exhaustion they felt lighter. For in this dry, unforgiving land they had coaxed forth a spring. Emma's face glowed in the last rays of daylight. Dust streaked her cheeks, but her smile shone through bright and steady. Jacob looked at her, and for the first time since her arrival, he did not see her as a stranger in silk stepping from a train. He saw her as she was now, a woman who had bent her back beside him, whose hands had blistered, whose spirit had not broken. And she saw him not as the stoic figure the town whispered about, but as a man who had dared to hope again. The cattle would drink, the land would breathe. And for both of them, a new thread had been woven, fragile but strong enough to hold. That night, as the stars returned, the sound of water lingered soft and steady like a promise whispered into the silence of the plains. And within that sound, in the stillness of the empty house, hope lived again. Part 6. The Fateful Rain. For weeks the sky had been merciless, a hard dome of blue that offered only sun and silence. Day after day the land had waited, cracked lips of earth splitting, wider cattle trudging with hollow eyes, hearts wearing thin beneath the strain of thirst. And then at last the change came. Late one afternoon, heavy clouds rose over the distant mountains. They gathered quickly, dark and swollen, folding over one another like waves of ink spreading across the sky. The golden light of evening vanished, swallowed whole by the deepening gray. The wind shifted, carrying the damp metallic scent of soil, long starved of moisture, mixed with the sharp fragrance of dry grass, aching for revival. Jacob stood at the edge of the porch, his eyes fixed upward. A streak of lightning cracked across the heavens, reflected in the depths of his gaze. His chest tightened with hope he dared not name. Could it truly be? Would the sky finally give what the land had begged for, what his soul had prayed for? Thunder rolled deep and resonant, as though the very earth was struck by a giant's drum. Emma rushed to the doorway, hair flying loose in the rising wind, her blue eyes wide with wonder. "Jacob," she called, her voice bright, almost laughing. "It's coming, the rain is coming." And then at last it did. At first, just a few drops, fat and scattered. They struck the roof with hollow thuds, pelted the parched ground, and released a raw, earthy fragrance, the smell of dust surrendering, of thirst being answered. Then the sky opened fully, and the heavens poured out. Rain fell in sheets, white and roaring. It struck the ground with a fury, soaking the brittle grass, flooding the cracks in the soil, streaming down the wooden walls of the cabin. Thunder boomed, lightning flared, and the storm's music filled the land, a symphony of rebirth. Emma stepped out from the safety of the porch. She lifted her hands, palms open to the downpour. Water soaked her dress in an instant, clinging to her frame, darkening the fabric. She tilted her face upward, laughing, her eyes sparkling brighter than the flashes above. Her laughter rang clear, echoing across the yard, mingling with the storm itself. She spun slowly, arms stretched wide, her brown hair plastered to her cheeks, her lashes jeweled with droplets. She looked less like a weary bride and more like a spirit of the rain itself, wild, free, radiant. Jacob remained under the porch, one hand gripping the rail. His chest rose and fell unevenly. For years he had locked such feelings deep, buried them beneath duty, silence, and solitude. But as he watched her laugh in the storm, he felt that careful wall crumbling. She was not a burden, not a stranger, not the silent obligation he had feared. She was alive, so alive that the barren world around her seemed to pulse again, as though her very presence commanded the land to bloom. His heart pounded strong and unsteady, each beat louder than the thunder above. Emma turned, catching his eyes through the curtain of rain. She smiled a smile luminous and inviting, brighter than the lightning itself. Then she lifted her hand palm, reaching toward him. "Come," she called gently. "Come out here with me." For a breath, Jacob resisted. He was a man built on solitude, on lines drawn in the sand, on distance that kept him safe. Stepping into that rain with her felt like stepping into a world he had long shut away. But his body moved before his mind could stop it. He left the shelter boots striking the wet earth. Rain hammered his shoulders, streamed down his hair, soaked his coat in seconds. The chill of it cut into his skin, but his chest burned hot alive in a way he had not felt for years. He stopped before her face wet, breath caught. She stood inches away, her breath mingling with his, her eyes blazing with joy, and something more, something that reached past the storm, past the years and straight into him. The storm raged around them, yet in that moment nothing else mattered. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Their eyes carried the words their lips could not form, their fear, their longing, their quiet surrender. Heart spoke in silence, and the silence was louder than thunder. Jacob had never thought he would feel this again, that his heart could be shaken, that his spirit could be lifted so high by something as simple as a smile. Emma, too, had not believed love could take root in soil so harsh, in a land so cruel. Yet here it was, sprouting between them, fragile and unstoppable. The rain kept falling harder still, carrying away dust and despair. Every drop washed the ranch clean, filling the air with the scent of life reborn. Jacob reached out, not with force, not with demand, but with a trembling hand that simply longed to bridge the distance. His fingers brushed hers, wet and warm despite the storm. Emma's lips curved again. Her hand slipped into his, small and sure. For a long while they stood like that, two figures joined in the deluge, held by nothing but trust and the promise of something just beginning. The prairie drank deep. The cattle lifted their heads, ears twitching as puddles formed around their hooves. The land, so long silent, seemed to sigh with relief. But it was not only the earth that was nourished that night. In the hearts of Jacob Thornton and Emma, something new began to flow. A hidden spring, long buried, was loosed by the storm. Not just water, but love, quiet, patient, and strong as the prairie itself. The storm thundered on, but within it lay a gentle truth: the land would heal. And so would they. Part 7. The Past Revealed. The rain did not let up. It had begun in the afternoon, and by midnight it was still pouring, drumming hard upon the tin roof, hammering out a rhythm that filled every corner of the wooden house. From the far ridge of the mountains came the rolling thunder, deep and resonant, carrying across the prairie like the echo of a giant drum. The air smelled thick with damp soil, the sharp scent of dust finely subdued, and the sweetness of grass soaking up its first drink after long months of thirst. The sky outside was as black as ink. Every so often, lightning tore it open, bathing the plains in a flash of white brilliance before darkness swallowed it again. The storm had made the land alive, but inside the cabin life held itself quiet, caught between firelight and shadows. In the hearth, the flames burned steadily, wood crackling as it gave its warmth. Golden light spilled across the walls, sketching tall, shifting shapes, the outline of a rocking chair, the dusty rack of rifles, the rough-cut table. And seated across from each other, two figures. Jacob leaned back, his broad frame sinking into the chair, one large hand loosely cradling a cup of coffee, long gone cold. His eyes were on the flames, yet his mind wandered elsewhere, circling thoughts he could not name. Emma sat closer to the fire. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her gaze reflecting the flicker of the blaze. The light caught in her eyes, turning them into bright pools that shimmered with something heavy, something she had carried for too long in silence. Outside, the rain roared on unbroken, but inside, a stillness stretched taut with something waiting to be spoken. Emma's shoulders rose and fell, her breath uneven. For a long while, she seemed to battle herself. At last, her voice broke the air so soft it nearly drowned beneath the storm. "Jacob," she said, "there is something I've never told anyone here." Jacob did not rush to answer. He gave only a small nod, turning his gaze from the fire to her face. He recognized the look in her eyes, the shadow of words too heavy to hold back any longer. He knew whatever came, it would not be light. Emma drew a breath, then released it slowly, her lips trembling, as though searching for strength. "I once had a marriage," she said. "Not a marriage of love, but of debt." The fire cracked sharply, as though it too acknowledged the harsh truth that had entered the room. Jacob's expression did not change, but he sat very still, listening, waiting. "My father," Emma continued, her voice trembling like a thread in the wind, "was a weak man. He gambled, and he lost. The debt he carried grew so heavy, there was no way he could ever repay it. The man he owed was Wittmann, a merchant, though I swear he was more demon than man, wealthy, influential, and colder than ice. I never saw him smile, not once." Emma's eyes clouded with memory. A clap of thunder shook the cabin, and she startled, but Jacob sat steady, immovable, as if offering himself as a wall against the storm within her. "The day he came to our house," she whispered, "I was 19. I remember the sound of his knock, hard, final. The sound of his boots on the wooden floorboards, each step dragging shadow into our home. My father trembled, and then I understood. I was the only thing left he had to barter." Her voice dropped lower, heavy with shame and fury entwined. "Wittmann looked at me not as a man looks at a woman, but as a buyer examines goods on a shelf. The bargain was made that same day I would be his wife and the debt would be erased." Her hand tightened upon her dress knuckles white. "From that day on, I lived in a house that was never mine. I bore the title of wife, but I was no more than an ornament, a doll paraded before others, so he could boast of what he owned. He never struck me, not with his hands, but every glance, every command, every cold demand of how I must sit, smile, speak it, cut deeper than any whip. I lived like a shadow, a prisoner in silken clothes. At dinners, at gatherings, I wore the smile he required, spoke the words he approved. To the world I was blessed. Inside I was nothing but an unending debt." Tears slid down her cheeks, but Emma did not hide them. Her voice shook, but her words cut clean sharp as a blade. "When Wittmann died, I did not mourn. I only breathed again like a prisoner whose chains had finally fallen. But in that moment I also saw the truth. I had never known love, never known what it meant to be held with warmth, never heard a word spoken for me, only for the debt I was traded for." Jacob's hand clenched upon his knee, the sinews straining. The knuckles whitened his grip so tight it seemed it might crush the wood beneath. He had never lived her story. He had never been bartered away. But he knew the cage of loneliness, the weight of existing only to serve silence. He thought of his own years, endless days in this very cabin, the wind his only company, and he saw in her pain a mirror of his own emptiness. Hers had been forced upon her, his chosen perhaps, but no less cruel. Emma wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand, giving a small, sad smile. "I came here, Jacob, not to seek wealth, not to run from some old love. I had none. I came because I wanted just once in my life to live as myself, to be seen as a person, not a possession, not a debt. The fire flared higher for a moment, flames leaping, casting her face in brighter light. It showed a woman weary from wounds of the past, yet still alive with a fragile longing for something better. Jacob leaned forward, his voice low and rough, yet steady as the ground beneath their feet. Emma, he said, here you are not anyone's debt. Here, you are yourself. She lifted her gaze, tears still clinging like dew to her lashes. In his eyes she found no pity, only understanding, deep, unwavering, a silent bond stronger than any promise. The rain hammered the roof, but the room grew warmer. Emma released a breath heavy and long, as if the burden of years had slipped from her shoulders. Jacob remained quiet, but the shadow of his frame stretched tall against the wall, as though to shield her from all that haunted her. And in that moment, the distance between them lessened. Pain, once borne alone, began to turn into something shared. The silence between them no longer threatened but comforted. The fire crackled on. The storm outside thundered. But within them both rose another sound, faint but true, the stirring of trust, delicate as new roots pressing into hard soil. It was not yet love. They did not name it so. But it was the beginning of something stronger than loneliness. Part 8. The enemy appears. The noon heat pressed heavy upon the prairie. The sky sagged low with gray clouds thick and brooding, as if the land itself was holding its breath for trouble yet unseen. The wind came dry and restless, sweeping red dust into swirls that stung the air and coated the rails of the fence. On the porch, Jacob swung his axe in steady rhythm. Each strike split wood with a sharp crack, sending the resinous scent of pine into the heat. Sweat ran down his back, soaking the rough fabric of his shirt. The smell of pitch and the hammering sun mixed together, thick and stifling. Not far away, Emma moved quietly across the yard. She lifted damp quilts from the wash-heavy still from last night's rain and spread them over the line to dry. The sleeves of her dress were rolled neatly above her elbows, her hands working quickly, yet her thoughts were elsewhere. For in her heart words still echoed Jacob's voice by the fire the night before. Here you are not anyone's debt. Here you are yourself. Those words had taken root, a tender warmth breaking through the frost of years. For the first time since she had stepped off the train, she felt the faint stirrings of home. A smile touched her lips, small but genuine. But peace on the frontier was always fragile. The first sound was distant hooves against the hard earth, faint and scattered. Then they grew louder, quicker, pounding with a steady urgency like a heart racing under strain. Jacob stopped mid-swing. He lowered the axe eyes, narrowing against the horizon. A speck had appeared upon the road, black against the shimmer of dust. Emma froze, a quilt slipping from her hand to the ground. The speck grew larger, taking shape. A rider upon a black horse cloak whipping in the wind, cutting a shadow across the pale land. Her heart stopped. She knew. Whitman. Even before his face cleared through the haze, she knew it was him. The pallor of his skin, the knife-edge lines of his face, the eyes that glinted with cold ownership. That image burned into her memory, rose again with cruel precision. Fear swept through her body like a winter gust. Her breath caught lips trembling as though she had swallowed ice. Memories rushed in bright rooms where she had been placed like an ornament, his gaze that weighed her as property, the endless nights in a house gilded with wealth yet empty of warmth. Every sound of hoofbeats pressed those memories harder, as if the past had galloped out of shadow to claim her once more. The black horse shrieked as it reared hooves, striking sparks against the dry ground. Whitman drew back the reins and stopped before the yard. Sitting tall, a figure of menace and command. His eyes swept. The ranch lingered on Jacob with disdain and finally fixed upon Emma. His lips twisted into a smile, a cruel, crooked line. "I have come," he said, his voice low and gravel rough, "to reclaim what has always been mine." Emma staggered backward, her hands clutching at her skirt, knees trembling. But Jacob stepped forward. He placed himself solidly before her, a wall of flesh and bone. His shoulders squared, his rough hands, still streaked with pine resin, tightening around the haft of the axe. The wind whipped his hair back, but his eyes, dark and steady, did not waver. "No one here." Jacob said, his voice heavy and rough as cracking timber is your property. Whitman barked a laugh, sharp and bitter. The sound carried cruelly on the wind. "Thornton," he sneered, drawing out the name. "And who are you, a poor rancher clinging to barren land? Do you think you can stand against me? One signature, one seal, and the law itself bows in my favor. Emma is mine, was mine, and shall always be mine." Emma's throat tightened. Shame burned hot through her chest. His words felt like shackles tightening once again around her wrists. The laughter in his tone, the cruel certainty it dragged her back into those hollow years when she had been paraded, commanded, owned. Jacob's eyes bored into Whitman's dark as the storm clouds above. Rage stirred in him, an urge to end it in one swing of his axe, but he held it down. Fury would risk Emma's safety. His voice came lower, steady as iron. "Your time is over, Whitman. She has chosen her life. Here she is free." The silence that followed was taut as a bowstring. The dust spun in circles around them, the wind hissing against the porch posts. Whitman leaned forward in the saddle, eyes alight with threat. "You will regret this," he growled. "The town remembers. They know she owes me. The law can be bent, and I know how to bend it. I will return, and when I do, you will have no defense." The black stallion reared again, screaming into the dry air. Whitman jerked the reins, wheeled the horse, and thundered back down the road, leaving behind a cloud of red dust that hung choking over the yard. Emma collapsed onto the steps, her hands gripping the wood, trembling. Her breath came ragged as though she had just escaped a noose. Jacob dropped beside her, one large hand closing firmly over hers. He said nothing. Words were not needed. The strength in his grasp spoke for him, a silent promise, a vow carved into his very being. His eyes, dark but steady, told her the rest. No one, not even Whitman, would ever take her again. The dust slowly settled back to earth, but the air remained heavy with the shadow of what had come. Inside the house, silence waited. Outside, the prairie wind carried away the last echo of hoofbeats. But in Emma's heart, one truth now stood firm: the past had ridden out of shadow to confront her, and it would not vanish so easily. Yet by her side stood Jacob, broad, unyielding, immovable as stone. And for the first time she believed she would not have to face the storm alone. Part 9. The Challenge. The sun blazed overhead, pouring down on Willow Creek with a heat so fierce it seemed ready to melt the very bricks of the street. The midday air clung heavy, thick with dust that lifted in red clouds beneath hurried boots. News had traveled faster than wildfire across the small frontier town. Jacob Thornton had challenged Whitman. The very same man whose shadow had darkened Emma's past was now called out face to face. The whispers spread into every saloon corner, across every shop counter, into the hushed kitchens where women stirred pots but listened with wide eyes. And when the hour came, the people poured out into the square before the old saloon, drawn as if by some unshakable pull. Their faces told the story of the town itself, hardened by dust, furrowed with labor, marked by worry and curiosity. Some eyes gleamed with hope, others clouded with dread. A gray-haired man shook his head as he muttered, "Thornton's gone mad. Whitman draws faster than any man west of the river. Jacob will be a dead man." But another voice, quieter yet firm, answered, "Or maybe justice is about to stand with the weak." The crowd shifted, restless, whispering. Children perched on barrels for a better view. Mothers clutched them tight, uncertain whether to shield their eyes or let them witness history. From one end of the square, Jacob appeared. He walked with the steady rhythm of a man who knew exactly why he was there. The brim of his hat was drawn low, shadowing his weathered face, his figure cut tall and sure against the blaze of the sun, every line of his body carrying the weight of resolve. At his side, the gleam of steel winked from the holstered revolver. His boots struck the packed earth with unhurried steps, each one echoing louder than the last. The murmurs of the crowd dimmed as he moved, for there was no trembling in his gait. He was not here for pride, not for vengeance. He was here for Emma, her freedom, her dignity, her right to live unchained. Across the square, Wittmann arrived astride his black stallion. The horse pranced, nostrils flaring, its hooves sparking against the dry ground. Cloak whipping about him, Wittmann sat tall, his face pale, carved from arrogance and cruelty. He pulled sharply on the reins, then swung down from the saddle, his boots striking the ground with a heavy, commanding thud. The sound rippled across the gathered crowd, silencing their whispers. He removed his gloves with slow, deliberate movements, letting the moment stretch. His dark eyes scanned the people with disdain before fixing on Jacob. A cruel smile tugged at his lips. Emma stood at the edge of the crowd. Her heart hammered so loud she thought it might burst. She longed to rush forward to beg Jacob to stop, to throw herself between them. But her legs betrayed her, rooted to the dust. She could do nothing but watch, her blue eyes wide torn between terror and pride. For the man who had once lived in silence had become somehow the wall she trusted her life against. Wittmann's voice cut through the still air, sharp as steel. "Thornton, you've no idea what you're walking into. I've outdrawn men faster than you could dream. Challenge me and you sign your own death warrant." Jacob did not flinch. Slowly, he peeled off one worn glove and let it fall to the dirt. The dust stirred, curling in the heat. His voice followed, deep and steady, rising above the restless wind. "This is no longer between you and me, Wittmann. This is about Emma. She is no one's possession. She is free. And if I must die to prove that truth, then I will." A hush fell like a curtain. Even the wind seemed to pause. His words struck something in the people, a chord buried deep in those who had long been bent beneath wealth and law, those who had known the weight of power wielded without mercy. In that moment, Jacob was no longer only one rancher. He was the voice of the voiceless, the stand of the overlooked. Two men now faced each other only a few paces apart. The air itself felt brittle, ready to shatter at the slightest movement. The sun burned above its glare, flashing upon the polished barrels of their guns. A minister, old and bent, stepped between them, a white handkerchief in his grasp. His voice was little more than a whisper, trembling as he raised the cloth. "When this falls," he said, "let heaven judge." The square fell silent. Every breath held, every eye fixed. The world narrowed to two men, two guns, and the thin scrap of cloth between them. The handkerchief slipped free, fluttering like a wounded bird. The moment it touched earth, Wittmann moved. His hand flashed to his holster with the speed of lightning steel gleaming in the noonday blaze. Jacob did not rush. His eyes held calm, his breath measured. It was as though he had lived every day of his life in preparation for this single heartbeat. His hand moved, deliberate yet certain. The square exploded with the crack of gunfire. One shot. The sound tore through the town, echoing off walls, reverberating into the distance. Smoke rose acrid and sharp, curling into the heavy heat. For an instant, no one breathed. Wittmann staggered. His eyes widened in disbelief. The revolver trembled in his grip, the hammer never fully pulled. His knees buckled. Dust rose as he collapsed, his black cloak spreading out behind him like a shadow finally broken. The silence broke. Gasps filled the air, some stifled cries, others awed whispers. Jacob stood where he had been, revolver still smoking in his hand. His face bore no triumph, no joy, only gravity. For this was not victory for glory's sake. It was survival. It was justice. It was the shield he had promised Emma with his very life. From the crowd, Emma pushed forward, tears streaming down her cheeks, though her lips curved into a trembling smile. She no longer cared who watched, no longer feared the whispers. She ran to him, her dress gathering dust, her heart soaring free. Jacob lowered his weapon as she reached him. Their eyes met. No words passed between them, yet everything was spoken. The crowd still murmured around them, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others whispering of justice long overdue. But for Jacob and Emma, the noise faded. All that remained was the truth of that moment. Wittmann's hold over her had ended. The chain had been broken. And in that brokenness, something new began, fragile yet fierce, born not only of survival, but of love and freedom. Part 10. The Mark of Love. The gunshot still echoed across Willow Creek, bouncing from wall to wall, carried on the dry wind like a bell tolling the end of an era. Smoke lingered in the air, sharp with the acrid sting of gunpowder clinging to every breath. The heat of noon pressed down fierce and heavy, yet no one in the square moved. The people of the town stood frozen, eyes wide, faces drawn, all fixed upon two men, one upright, steady as a pillar of stone, the other sprawled in the dust, his black cloak spread like the shadow of defeat. Whitman groaned, clutching the blood that seeped from his shoulder. His pale face twisted with fury, though his strength drained quickly away. The revolver slipped from his fingers and fell useless to the dirt. His ragged breath sounded more like the whimper of a wounded beast, cornered at last. Jacob remained where he stood, revolver still smoking in his hand. The crowd expected another shot, the final stroke to end it. But his eyes, dark and steady, carried no hunger for death. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the gun. His gaze swept the crowd, then found Emma. She was pushing through the throng, her hair loose from its pins, her face streaked with tears. For that moment, all else faded. He saw only her. When he spoke, his voice was rough but strong, carrying to every ear in the square. "I don't need to kill to prove justice. Whitman, you will live not as a master, not as a tyrant, but as a man broken for all to see. Let this town remember your money, and your power could never chain a free soul." Murmurs rippled outward, whispers tumbling like a wave through the people, until silence claimed them again. All eyes turned from Whitman's crumpled figure to the man who had stood against him. Emma reached the edge of the circle. Her chest rose with quick, uneven breaths, her tears glistening in the pitiless sun. She looked at Jacob, and in her eyes was not only relief, not only gratitude, but something deeper, something that had bloomed in the spaces between fear and trust. Jacob faced the townsfolk. He removed his hat, holding it firmly at his side. His voice rang out calm and unwavering. "Before all gathered here in Willow Creek, I say this. Emma is no debt. She is no man's property. She is not a possession to be bartered or bound. She is my wife, my partner, my equal. And from this day forward, let every soul know none may touch her save through love and respect." The declaration rolled across the square, carried by the hot wind, settling upon each listener like a stone upon their hearts. A stir moved through the crowd, some gasps, some nods, some murmured amens. Then the old minister stepped forward, shoulders bent but eyes bright. He raised a worn Bible, its leather cracked from years of hands and prayers. His voice trembled, but its words rang true. "If this be your vow spoken before God and this community, then so shall it be witnessed. Let it be known this day, a union not forged in debt, nor in power, but in choice, in freedom." Emma's lips quivered as tears spilled freely down her cheeks. She stepped forward, her hands trembling, and placed them in Jacob's. His were broad, roughened by rope and reins, scarred by years of toil, but warm enough to steady her. He closed his hand around hers, firm as a vow carved in stone. Behind them, Whitman lay crumpled, his cloak. Dust stained, his power drained away. The eyes of the crowd no longer turned to him with fear. They looked past him as though his shadow had already dissolved into the dirt. He was no longer a master. He was only a man stripped of illusion, watching as the town bore witness to the one thing he could never own. The church bell tolled in the distance, its notes slow and solemn. Each ring echoed through the square, across the rooftops, into the wide prairie beyond. Emma lifted her face shining with tears, and Jacob leaned close, his voice low, meant only for her ears. "From this day, you are free, and you are mine, not as debt, not as burden, but as the love I had thought I'd never find." Her smile broke through the tears, tender and radiant. The square around them shifted. One by one, townsfolk began to nod, some clapping shoulders, some bowing heads, their silence turning into something heavier acceptance. They had not only seen a duel, they had witnessed a beginning. The sun still burned above the dust, still swirled, but something in Willow Creek had changed. Emma and Jacob stood side by side, their hands bound not by law nor by bargain, but by choice. Theirs was a bond sealed not in the hush of a chapel, but in the open air before the eyes of all, sealed with courage, with truth and with love. Wittmann's groans faded into the background, the sound of a shadow fading. The people turned away from him, their gazes fixed instead upon the pair who now carried the weight of a promise. The heat of noon bore down. The wind lifted the dust. Yet in the middle of that square, amid the echoes of gunfire and the tolling bell, love had left its mark, etched deep into two hearts, etched into the memory of a town, etched into the very soil of the prairie. For threats may rise, storms may come, and the land may test them again. But what had been spoken that day would endure. Emma was free, and Jacob's vow would stand. And so, under the burning sun of Willow Creek, amidst the dust and the sweat and the echoes of battle, a new life began, no longer haunted by chains, but rooted in the quiet, steadfast strength of love. Spring on the ranch winter had returned to Willow Creek. Snow blanketed the cabin roof soft and heavy, smoothing every line of the shingles into white silence. The prairie, once split and cracked by drought, now lay beneath a quilt of frost. The wind whistled around the porch posts, sharp with the bite of ice, but within the cabin, a fire crackled steadily in the hearth. Its glow spilled golden through the windows, pushing back the shadows of night-painting warmth against the snow that pressed close outside. Beyond the house, the land whispered its quiet promise. Rows of earth that once lay barren now held the tender shoots of life, tiny spears of green peeking through the thin crust of snow. The seedlings bent gently beneath their icy cover, waiting. They were small, fragile, but undeniable, the mark of a season turning the vow of spring preparing to come. Inside the cabin, the air held not only warmth but peace. Jacob stood by the window, his tall frame outlined in the firelight. Beside him, Emma leaned close, her small hand wrapped within his. His rough palm dwarfed hers, yet held it carefully as though it were the most precious thing he had ever carried. They said nothing. There was no need. The quiet spoke for them, carried by the rhythm of snow, tapping against the glass, and the steady beat of two hearts resting together. Once Jacob had known only silence here, the long, empty winters of a man without company, his days filled with work, his nights with the creak of boards and the moan of wind. Now the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was full of presence, of shared breath, of a warmth that had nothing to do with firewood or blankets. Jacob turned his head slightly, his voice low and rough, softened by affection. "We had a hard beginning, Emma, but now, I think I can finally call this place home." Emma lifted her eyes toward him. In the glow of the flames, her blue gaze shimmered, touched with light. She rested her head upon his shoulder, her lips curving with quiet certainty. Sometimes she whispered, "What we need isn't safety, it's love. The kind of love that makes us come alive again." Her words lingered in the air, gentle as falling snow. Jacob's arm wrapped around her shoulders, drawing her nearer. He did not answer with words, for words often failed him. Instead, he held her close, steady as the ground itself, and in that embrace was every promise he knew how to give. Outside, the snow fell in thick curtains, blurring the line between sky and earth, but inside, the cabin glowed with life. The fire hissed and popped, casting sparks upward like fireflies. The scent of pine logs burning mingled with the faint sweetness of bread cooling on the table. Every corner of the room held some sign of Emma, now curtains stitched by her careful hands, a vase of dried wildflowers from the meadow, the quilts she had mended and laid across the chairs. What had once been bare and hollow had grown warm and lived in. Jacob noticed these things in silence, but each one marked a change greater than he had thought possible. The cabin was no longer only his, it was theirs. For Emma, too, the change was profound. She had once stood in this house and seen only emptiness, walls stripped of life rooms echoing with loneliness. She had feared she would never belong. Yet now, as she moved from the hearth to the table, from the window to the fire, she felt the walls breathe differently. This was not a prison, it was sanctuary. The scars of the past had not vanished. Memories still lingered sharp as old wounds, but they no longer ruled her. For the first time, she was not a debt, not an ornament, not a shadow in someone else's story. She was Emma Thornton, wife, partner, equal. Jacob turned once more to the window. The snow caught the moonlight silver and unbroken. The land will live again, he murmured almost to himself. The cattle will drink. The fields will grow. Spring is coming. Emma slipped her hand into his, her voice soft but steady. And so will we. After all we've been through, we'll bloom too. For a long while they stood together, watching the snow fall over a land that had nearly broken them both, and yet had brought them to each other. The fire warmed the room. The snow wrapped the earth in silence. And in between, within those walls, a love endured quiet, steadfast, unshaken by storm or drought. And so the story of Jacob and Emma did not end with a gunshot, nor with the fall of an enemy. It ended here in the hush of winter and the fragile stirrings of spring. It ended not with chains but with freedom, not with fear but with peace. A cowboy who had once lived only with silence now shared his days with laughter and voice. A woman once bound by debt now walked in freedom, her spirit unshackled, her heart alive. Together they had written a new chapter upon the land, a chapter not of power nor of wealth, but of love. Outside, snow still fell thick and endless. Yet within the cabin, light glowed warm, steady, and true. And it would remain through winters and springs to come the mark of a love that had healed, endured, and blossomed on the hard soil of the West.